Tonight I'm going to talk about the argument I make in this new book, The End of America. And I'm just going to speak from my heart about what I see happening right now and what we need to do about it. And I kind of want to issue a bit of not a warning, but almost like like those rides you go on in Disneyland where, if they're very turbulent, you get a heads up. It's a very difficult message. In some ways, I'm going to take you on a difficult journey, but I want to reassure you that we're going to come out to sunshine and hope. If not sunshine, certainly hope on the other side. So the book, this is why I wrote the book. I wrote the book for an older person and for a younger person in my life. The older person is a mentor of mine who is the daughter of Holocaust survivors. And we would sit around chatting about news events. And she kept saying, they did this in Germany. They did this in Germany. And at that time, I thought that this was a nutty thing to say, really extreme, really rhetorical, and I just disregarded it. But she kept saying, they did this in Germany. They did it in Germany. And she wasn't talking about the later years, National Socialist outcomes. She was talking about the early years, 1930, 1931, 1932, when Germany was a modern parliamentary democracy, a fragile one, but it would have been very recognizable to us. Germany in the early 30s had pop stars and Bauhaus architecture and Paris fashion and civil rights organizations, gay rights organizations, sex education organizations, page 6 writers, gossip columnists. And it was a democracy. And so she was talking about the very early pressures on a democracy, legal pressures on a democracy, by people who were intent on closing down that democracy. And I kept sort of brushing this off, but finally she sat me down and she gave me a stack of books and she almost physically said, read. And I started reading. And honestly, my hair stood on end because I saw that she was right. She wasn't being rhetorical at all. That in fact, not only were there tactical echoes from the past, but that what I was seeing was actual scenes recurring, imagery recurring, language, sound bites recurring in modern events in America. So then I began reading even more about how democracies close down or how would-be despots crack down on the democracy movement. So I read about Italy in the 20s, and as always, Mussolini was the great innovator. He sort of pioneered this technology of closing down a modern democracy. I read about Germany in the 30s, as I mentioned, about Russia in the 30s, about East Germany in the 50s, Czechoslovakia in the 60s, Pinochet's coup in Chile, and I read about the Chinese crackdown on the democracy movement at the end of the 80s. And what became completely clear to me is that every would-be despot, every would-be dictator, whether they're on the left or the right, does the same 10 things. There's a blueprint to closing down an open society or crushing a democracy movement. And that, Mussolini kind of drafted this blueprint, and then Hitler studied Mussolini, Stalin studied Hitler, Hitler studied Stalin. The great dictators all kind of perfected it from one another. But then the petty dictators all over the world in the latter part of the 20th century, beginning of this century, reproduced the blueprint. We teach the blueprint at the School for the Americas. We teach the blueprint. So that, if you remember Thailand last spring, in 1 week it was a democracy, a week later it was a military dictatorship. And it was like they were going through a shopping list, and the way they worked. That was the blueprint. You see Burma, Myanmar, 2 weeks ago, because I know the blueprint, I was looking at my watch. Today they're marching the street. In 48 hours they're going to be shooting on the monks protesting. In a week they're going to be suspending communications. The blueprint is predictive. And what was even more chilling to me, and this is where I really have to applaud you for coming here on a Thursday night when you could be watching America's Next Top Model and listening to this. It's very brave of you. What became clear to me is that each of these 10 steps, these 10 classic steps that every would-be dictator puts in place are underway right now in the United States. I also had to write this book when I realized that because of a younger person in my life, two people actually. Jennifer Gandon and Chris Lee. She's a wonderful 28-year-old student that I mentored, a writer. And she was marrying Chris, who's a wonderful 28-year-old activist. And knowing the storm clouds that were gathering around this young couple, I realized that, I had to do more than just get them something from Crate and Barrel, that I had to give them something that would help them in a time like this. And so I wrote the book really for them, as well as for my older friend, because what it is a kind of refresher, a reminder to Americans. We don't tend to think about history a lot, I don't either, about how societies closed down in the past, a blueprint, and also a refresher about what democracy is and how to sustain it at a time when it's under assault. So that's why I wrote this book. And actually, Chris's own story is kind of very moving to me because his mom was 28 herself when she took the 4-month-old Chris in her arms and fled Vietnam to get into a boat and sail across the ocean as a refugee, as a boat person, to arrive in this country because she understood liberty the way the founders understood liberty. It's an understanding we've kind of forgotten, we've gotten lazy about. She understood that it was worth risking her life and her child's life to raise her baby in liberty, in freedom. So that's the kind of consciousness we have to remember now in order to fight back against the kind of pressures that I'll be describing. So what are these 10 steps? And by the way, before I tell you the 10 steps, I just want to invoke something that was kind of amazing to me to discover. Civics is so boring, right? How many of you took civics in middle school or high school? Show of hands? That's pretty good, but it's still like half of the audience, and this is a self-selected, engaged audience. People don't take civics anymore. It's not mandatory anymore. So there's this whole generation coming up that really doesn't know what democracy is. But what we're not taught, we're sort of given this Hallmark card view of the mood the founders were in when they drafted the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. It's like freedom, confident, expansive. That is not true. When you go back and read the founding fathers, I mean, there were mothers too, but they were disenfranchised. Took a while for, us to get included. You see that they were writing in a state of dread and fear because the founders knew in their bones that an American despot could easily arise in America to oppress Americans. They knew it. They knew it from their own experience. They had fled, or their parents had fled, countries where, like in England, Tom Paine was tried for sedition, for writing The Rights of Man. He could have been hanged by the Crown for writing that book. Countries where Quakers were tortured by the state for their beliefs. That's why they came to Philadelphia. And so the founders, in their hearts and their lived experiences knew what tyranny was. And so they wanted to create a place where you were safe from that kind of oppression. And that's why they set our system of checks and balances as they did. Checks and balances, what a boring term, right? I mean, we are not taught that this system is this sexy, passionate, amazing, inspiring concept, this radical vision of human self-determination. But they knew without a doubt that it was human nature to abuse power if power was unchecked, and that was why these checks and balances were so important. So what are these 10 steps that so profoundly assault the founders' vision and put us at risk? The first thing every would-be dictator does is to invoke a terrifying internal and external threat. And very often this threat can be real, and they'll hype it or use it manipulatively. For example, Stalin talked about sleeper cells. Who's heard that term in the last 6 years? Right? Right. Now, had you heard that term in the 80s or 90s? I hadn't. What are sleeper cells? Stalin said sleeper cells are capitalist agents, meaning us, capitalist terrorists, who were dressing like Soviet citizens, acting like Soviet citizens, hiding among good Soviet citizens sneakily, waiting for the moment, perhaps for years, when at a signal they would rise up and create anti-Soviet terrorist mayhem, right? So this was a hyped threat, didn't exist. It's a narrative that recurs, and what you'll see in what I'm sharing with you is that it's almost like someone in the Bush administration has gone back and seen what worked and just basically lifted those images, that language. Homeland, Heimat, right? Embedding of journalists. Goebbels pioneered the embedding of journalists. Leni Riefenstahl was embedded with troops going into Poland. Take a look at Mission Accomplished and take a look at the scene in Triumph of the Will where the Fuhrer is descending in a plane and greeted by his uniformed staffers, and he says, we need your support in accomplishing our mission. So many echoes. I mean, I started feeling this feeling of deja vu when I was like, okay, people are burning Dixie Chicks CDs. CDs don't burn. They like emit toxic smoke. Why is this so familiar? And of course, Goebbels in 1933 staged spontaneous gatherings of students where they burned books. And again, you see these echoes. So Stalin's was a hyped threat, but Pinochet told Chileans in 1973 about a real threat. There were really armed insurgents, but then he hyped it with fake documents, which is something despots often do. And remember, we saw fake documents when the White House showed the yellow cake documents, that there's a whole book saying everyone's like, no, they're fake, they're fake. But they said, oh, Niger is buying uranium. I'm sorry, Iraq is buying uranium from Niger. We can't wait for the smoking gun to come in the form of a mushroom cloud. And so we were duped into invading Iraq. So similarly, Pinochet held up what he called Plan Z, fake documents that purported to show that these armed insurgents were going to blow up all this infrastructure and assassinate all these leaders at once. Fake, but it terrified Chilean citizens so that they didn't fight hard for their democracy when the coup was attempted. The second thing a would-be despot always does is to create a secret prison system where torture takes place that is outside the rule of law. And very often, they will also establish military tribunals that strip prisoners of due process. Again, Lenin was the innovator this time, but Mussolini studied Lenin and developed his system called Confino. Hitler studied Stalin and developed the People's Court system. I beg your pardon, Hitler studied Mussolini with the People's Court system, and Stalin studied Hitler. And so what happens when you have a military tribunal system and a secret prison system outside the rule of law where torture takes place is that it starts to put pressure on the rest of civil society. And I'll tell you how. Now, this is really difficult. But this is like, I've started to offer $50,000 for anyone who can do this, even though I don't happen to have $50,000 handy. But I invite you to name a society that created a secret prison system outside the rule of law where torture takes place that didn't sooner or later turn the abuse against its own citizens. So why should we worry about the fact that brown people with Muslim names on this far-off island are being tortured? The White House says we don't torture. It's a lie. They're being tortured systemically. People in US-held prisons in Iraq are being tortured. People at black sites are being tortured. Why should it bother us? I mean, my brother's a really decent guy, but he said, that's not my issue before he read my argument. And so apart from the moral issue, why should we worry that the state has legalized torture? The reason we should worry is that in what I call a fascist shift, and I use that term very conservatively, I use it technically, not rhetorically. There are many definitions of fascism, my dictionary definition